Hello and welcome to Episode 6 of the Battle of the Rappahannock custom multiplayer game. In Part 5, we reviewed the turns between 12 and 1:40 p.m. We saw that Reynolds continued to fall back over on the Federal left, while Sickles crossed the Hazel River and began to push against the Confederate left flank. Meade also was able to get into the action by crossing at Tin Pot Ford and driving back the Confederate center. We are now at the 2 p.m. staff meetings. These are the first open discussions the sides have had since 12 o'clock, and it's the last discussion they will have until 4 p.m. Beginning with the Confederate discussion, with the armies now engaged in combat along an extremely long front, Lee was now confident that both armies had chosen the same maneuver for the battle, to attack the right flank of the enemy. Both armies have their strength concentrated on their right. The Hazel River is no longer an obstacle for the Yanks, and their first objective will surely be Brandy Station. They will also be looking to maul the scattered elements of Anderson's corps. Lee was admittedly baffled by the movements of Reynolds' force, which seemed to be moving away from the other parts of the Federal Army. Perhaps Hooker's plan was to put so much pressure on Anderson that Lee would be forced to recall men from the east of the Rappahannock to support them. But Lee would not consider this. He wanted to crush Reynolds and capture the Federal objectives. Hill supported the continued attack on Reynolds, stating, "I believe we must do everything possible to keep the 1st and 2nd Union Corps on their back foot." But Hill also stated that the day was growing older, and that there were still many more miles to go to reach the Federal objectives along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. But Anderson, Hill continued, was in a bad position. "I think the situation is very concerning on the whole. Once the Yanks get their advanced columns a little more spread out, they will have the advantage to strike and put overwhelming pressure on any point they choose, while enemy cavalry will have free rein to travel around the edges and possibly get behind our scattered defenses all along our side of the Rappahannock." Ewell also supported the continued push against Reynolds. He told the generals that we must push forward and make them regret not reinforcing the 1st and 2nd Corps. "I will say that my hope is that we inflict enough losses in our area that they will have no choice but to redirect forces away from Anderson. The faster we can push them, the more likely that will happen." For the 2 p.m. rebel orders, McLaws was to abandon the Hazel River line and fall back towards Brandy Station. Wilcox was to delay the Federals at Tin Pot Ford and then fall back fighting towards Brandy Station. For General Ewell, he was to dispatch the bulk of Hampton's division to the west to try and cut off the retreat of Reynolds' force by moving directly on Morrisville against their flank. Ewell was also to continue the pursuit of Reynolds with his 2 infantry divisions from the south. For General Hill, he was ordered to have Rhodes continue to hold his position, threatening Sykes' Federals at Wheatley's Ford and blocking the direct road between Reynolds and Sykes. He was also to have Pender support the attack by Ewell against Reynolds' force. Over to the Federal side of the 2 p.m. discussion now. Sickles reported good progress along his lines and planned to keep driving southward towards Brandy Station and Culpeper. Over on the other flank, Reynolds was tired of falling back and requested that he be allowed to stop and defend Morrisville. "Having spent most of this campaign in retreat, to avoid being trapped by the enemy, I intend to now stand my ground." Hooker agreed with Reynolds that it was time for Reynolds to turn and make a stand against the rebel pursuers. The high-level goal here is to make a stand and complete the concentration of your force in the process. You block their head-on assault in your middle and force them to deploy to flank you. I know they have sufficient strength to do this, but it will take them time if you can hold in your center. When they do deploy, move off to the north-northeast to preserve your Grand Division. This is not a hold-at-all-costs proposition at Morrisville. For Meade's part, he would cross at Tin Pot Ford with Barnes's and Crawford's divisions in pursuit of the Confederates falling back at that point. while Sykes would pull his division back to the north and cross the Rappahannock to rejoin the rest of the 5th Corps, leaving only a small force at Tin Pot Ford to guard against any rebel pursuit. So my unasked for 2 cents, as always, about this. Let's begin with the Confederates. First off, why the obsession with objectives? The battle is far more likely to end through battlefield losses than objectives gained. And I think the Confederates will realize this sooner rather than later, but as of now, they are still aiming for the objectives and not the Union Army. Anderson to Brandy Station. Okay, but then what? Once the Confederates fall back to Brandy Station, are they going to defend that area? Are they going to keep going back to Stevensburg? Will they try to sweep over to the east and rejoin the rest of the army? Question mark. I'm not too sure. It really feels like there's just 2 different battles being fought right now, and I don't think that's anybody's fault. I think it's just the way the battle has progressed. In the east, it looks like Hampton could be riding into some trouble. He does not know how many Federal cavalrymen there are in his front, nor that there is Federal infantry there just yet, but he's about to find out real quick. For the Federals, is Reynolds being abandoned? Because it kind of feels like that. Sickles is already to the west of the Rappahannock River, and now Meade is moving to join him there, leaving Reynolds alone to fight 2/3 of the rebel army. On a side note, Anderson and Reynolds are really getting the short end of the stick in this battle. Both are competing against the bulk of the enemy forces. And why is Meade even crossing at Tin Pot Ford? Sickles can handle Anderson all by himself. There's no need for Meade to join in that fight. Instead, I think he should be going back the opposite direction and trying to reinforce Sykes. Because Sykes falling back to the north could end in total disaster. This move could leave Reynolds' right flank wide open and allow the Confederates to march all the way north as far as Tin Pot Ford. And Anderson would then be given an easier escape route to the east if he needs to use it. All right, let's go ahead and get into these turns now. This is the end of the 2 p.m. turn, and General Ward has continued to put pressure on the rebels over in the west. The 3rd Corps is advancing south against McLaws' line, and they greatly outnumber the Confederates in their front. In the east, Hampton has been blocked along his road and ran into an unexpected Federal force along his line of march. 2:20 p.m., Kershaw is heading north, which doesn't make any sense as I thought the Confederates were falling back to Brandy Station. I guess we're going to have to see what happens here, but as of now, I'm a bit perplexed. In the center, Mahone's brigade has been routed by the Federal attack. They are now completely across Tin Pot Ford, and there is no Confederates left anywhere near that crossing point. And is Hampton actually outmaneuvering the Federals? Despite the fact that he was surprised, he has enough units and enough mounted cavalrymen to get around the Federal flank, and the Federals are going to have to do some maneuvering of their own to counter this. It's too early to tell how this is going to turn out, but stay tuned. Lastly, I want to take a closer look at one thing here in the center of the battlefield. Zooming in on that area, you can see that the Rappahannock River cuts right through the middle of this map along that line. Wheatley's Ford is located right there on the map, and there is a crossing point which runs from northwest to southeast right there. On the Confederate side of the river, there are about 1,400 men concealed in the woods there. There are 289 cavalrymen in battle formation just to the north of that crossing point, and there's a 4-gun battery just to the south of the crossing point. On the Federal side, Burbank's brigade is defending at the fort itself. He has 3 regiments right here in this hex, and an additional one here facing south. And we're going to begin by looking at this stack here. To begin with, the direction they are facing exposes them to enfilading fire, both from the cavalrymen on one side and the artillery on the other side. And should those artillerymen get tired of firing at their flank, well, they can just fire directly ahead and hit the Federal infantrymen just 2 hexes away. And this is causing just unnecessary losses for the Federal Army. So let's just stop and ask, well, what's the goal here for the Federals? Well, the goal is to guard Wheatley's Ford, right? And what is the problem here? Well, the problem is that flanking fire is causing heavy losses. So what's the solution? Starting with this unit here, every time the rebel guns fire, they have a standard fire value of 2200 at a range of just 2 hexes. Whoa, God help us, math. So feel free to hit pause if you want, and you can read this. But what's important to understand here at the end is that they are going to inflict between 11 and 55 Federal losses per turn in that hex. Coming back to this map, you can see that that hex is not an ideal position to have Federal troops stationed in. When the Confederates shift their fire to enfilading this line here, they have a standard fire value of 1400 at a range of 3 hexes. The math of this equals between 7 and 35 losses per turn in this position for the Federals. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is simply to fall back into the woods. If they were to do this, they would be able to take advantage of a 40% modifier by being in that covered area. And the losses drop to between 5 and 25 for the 3 units guarding the ford, and the losses drop to between 3 and 15 for the unit that was in open fields just 2 hexes north of the Confederate guns. And they are still blocking the ford, which is really what the entire purpose of Burbank's brigade being in this position in the first place is. Over time, all these casualties add up. So when you leave troops in an exposed position for 2, 3, 4 turns, over a game of 100 turns, you might be looking at 3,000-4,000 losses that you didn't have to take. Use the modifiers. I tell people this all the time, and I'm shocked how seldom they listen. Any chance you have to use a modifier, use the modifier. Back to the overhead map now at 2:40 p.m. Sickles has continued his advance against McLaws's forces and pushed them out of the woods directly in his front. In the center, Meade is also advancing. He's moved more men across Tin Pot Ford and is pushing the Confederates back. In the east, Reynolds has moved into defensive mode. His forces are getting aligned and they are preparing for the Confederate assault they know is coming. 3 o'clock now, and it is a Donnybrook over in the west. And we're going to zoom in on that area here. And it's just pure chaos right now. Put in the labels on the map here, you can see that both sides have 2 brigades and then some cavalry as well. But the Confederates have managed to isolate these 2 Federal cavalry units in this position here. Further, because of some unfortunate routes for the Federals, they now have 22 unprotected and unlimbered guns in the center of their line. And they have an unprotected leader as well, just sitting out in the open. They are just flirting with disaster right now. The Confederates move next, and if they take full advantage of this situation, they could easily capture a dozen guns, a Federal leader, along with a few hundred Federal cavalrymen who are isolated right there. Meade is continuing his crossing. He now has the bulk of his force to the western side of the Rappahannock River. At Wheatley's Ford, the Federals did not fall back into the woods as I hypothesized they should. Instead, they attacked across the ford. It's not going to end well. 3:20 p.m. and the Federal cavalry was captured over in the east by the Confederate forces, but they did not advance against the Federal guns. This was a mistake, but because of line of sight and other issues, they simply didn't know how exposed the Federal guns were in their center. On Sickles' front, he continues to push the Confederates back and is making good progress. Over at Wheatley's Ford, Burbank's brigade is now in a tight spot. They are isolated on the Confederate side of the river, and Rhodes's division has began a general attack against Sykes's force because Burbank is now out of the picture. And in the east, there is major fighting now going on between the forces of Ewell and Hill and John Reynolds. And we're going to zoom in here to take a quick look at this. You can see that Reynolds' Grand Division has formed a semicircle facing south, while Ewell's Corps is opposing them, along with Pender's division in support. and they are putting massive pressure against the Federals on the southern part of their line. And the Federals have no real reserves to call upon if there is a disaster. And we have reached a milestone in this game. The Federals are now 50% to their loss limit for this battle, while the Confederates are at 38% to their loss limit for the battle. Remember, if either side crosses that limit, the game ends in a victory for their opponents. Looking at the Federal order of battle here, feel free to hit pause if you would like. I'm just going to point out a few things. So far, the Federals have taken 10,244 total losses. For Reynolds, he's lost almost 1/5 of his total force since the beginning of the battle, but a huge chunk of that actually just comes from the Iron Brigade, which was captured early on. Hooker's Grand Division has also taken nearly 1/5 casualties, but most of that is because of the losses in the Cavalry Corps, which have been pretty heavy up to this point. For Sickles, his Grand Division has lost just 579 men, because really they are just now getting into the battle. Down on the bottom there, you can see that the vast majority of points that the Federals have lost come from losing so many cavalrymen and artillerymen. And really, this is what happens in this club all the time. Losses from cavalrymen and artillerymen add up so much faster than they do for infantrymen. You should always try to find ways to protect your artillery and minimize your cavalry losses. Looking at the Confederate order of battle now, again, you can feel free to hit pause if you like. The shocking thing, I think, is that Anderson's First Corps has actually taken more losses than the other two infantry corps combined. He's lost just over 1,900 men, while the 2nd and 3rd Corps have lost just over 1,500. It seems crazy, especially since Ewell and Hill have been attacking all morning. But Anderson's also been doing a lot of fighting at Tin Pot Ford and against Sickles' advance, so it is understandable. But the bulk of the Confederate losses come from the Cavalry Corps. Stuart has lost nearly 2,000 of his men, and that is what is accounting for the majority of their victory points lost. The final turn here in this phase, 3:40 p.m., and Meade is moving to the west. He is now completely across the river and is pushing the Confederates back. Over in the east, Hampton has been stopped. The Federals have done a good job of stopping Hampton's attack and refusing to allow him to get in behind their flank. To the south of Hampton, though, the big battle is really occurring just around Morrisville. And we're going to zoom in one more time here before we end this video and take a quick look at the Morrisville area. Bringing back up the labels here, you can see that the Confederates have really plowed into the Federal line and have massed their forces against the southern part of the Federal line. And they are attacking repeatedly against these Federals, but so far, the Federals have held. And they have managed to launch a counterattack against the Confederate right flank, hoping to disrupt and rout them and relieve the pressure along other parts of the line. My unasked for 2 cents about this? Well, looking at the map here, let's just say it's a battle now. Sickles is now in the fight, feels like he's been marching all morning, and Meade is across the river and he's fighting as well. Whereas in the east, the Reynolds versus Ewell and Hill battle that we've been waiting for all day is now occurring. But is Meade going the right way here? Should he be going to the west, or should he be turning back and going to the east? Sykes' division, they must be feeling really lonely right about now, as Rhodes' division has began to attack them. In the east, Ewell has to keep attacking against Reynolds' forces. It's simply too late to turn back now. The sun is beginning to set, they've got a few more hours of daylight left, and he's going to need all the time possible to first break through the Federal lines and then exploit whatever success they achieve. And for right now, Hampton has been stopped. So if he's unable to get around that Federal flank, there still exists a way for the Federals to escape towards Elkton. But Reynolds' flanks are very precarious right now. The Confederates are trying desperately to get around both of them in order to hem the Federals in and prevent them from escaping. And as I mentioned, there's just 2 hours until dusk. If the sun sets and the Federals still hold their positions, they're going to be able to build breastworks all night long. So what am I looking forward to in the next part? Well, can Reynolds hold? mean, that's the obvious question right now. How much longer can he continue to resist these really heavy Confederate attacks, which are striking his lines? Also, what will Meade do? Will he go west, or will he turn back and go to the east? Lastly, will Sickles be able to do any open field running? Thus far, he's been hemmed in, he's been going through woods, and the Confederates have effectively slowed him down. Once they get through these woods, though, the Federals are going to have an opportunity to really get out in the open and maybe make up some ground. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. Be sure to give it a like on here. And there will be another episode coming up soon. Thank you.